Hi everyone, I'm John Cornelius and this is a Thought Cooperative presentation on Freud's theory of dreams. I'm going solo on this one, so we'll see how it goes. Now everyone seems to know that Sigmund Freud found dreams interesting and fundamental to his study of the mind, something he called psychoanalysis. However, it's interesting and important to know exactly what Freud's model of dreaming is, so we can both understand his model, its implications, and how new theories have both developed and challenged many of his ideas about dreaming. So let's take a look. In 1897, Freud, aged 41, began his famous but somewhat dubious self-analysis. Additionally, Freud had always been an active dreamer himself, and much of his self-analysis involved dreams. Freud therefore decided to write a book on dreams, and the interpretation of dreams was completed in 1899. He had already noticed that when he asked his patients to free associate, they regularly discussed their dreams. Their associations seemed to include material from the day before, something he eventually called day residue, but also incorporated material from the individual's past, integrating the information in many different ways. Also, in discussing the dreams and their meanings with Freud, there seemed to be an opening up of new areas of psychic exploration. Occasionally, this would lead to sudden bursts of personal insight and a relief of symptoms that had plagued the person for a long time. However, what most people do not realize is that for Freud, sleep was best when it was completely dreamless. He actually did not believe dreams were a necessary part of sleep, and stated in 1916, "A dreamless sleep is the best, the only proper one. There ought to be no mental activity in sleep." Instead, dreams served only one purpose. They were a reflexive and physiologic process that was completely designed to keep people asleep. Or to say it another way, dreams functioned only to be guardians of sleep. In 1925, he says it quite plainly. There is only one useful task, only one function that can be ascribed to a dream, and that is the guarding of sleep from interruption. To explore this model, we need to understand that for Freud, infant and waking life were full of emotions, drives, wishes, and experiences that our minds simply could not consciously handle, and that loaded psychic material would regularly be repressed or buried in the unconscious. In 1907, Freud said it this way: "There is, in fact, no better analogy for repression, by which something in the mind is at once made inaccessible and preserved, than burial of the sort to which Pompeii fell victim, and from which it could emerge once more through the work of spades." The problem is that during the night, there is less automatic repression. These latent dream thoughts would bubble up. If unchecked, these infantile wishes, drives, and traumas would be experienced in ways that would be so intense that people would repeatedly wake up. If people kept waking up, they would suffer from sleep deprivation and increasing mental impairments until they simply could not function anymore. Clearly, there would be an evolutionary advantage to those who slept better, so a psychic system evolved just for that purpose. What Freud proposed is that each of us therefore has a censor, whose job it is to keep such material safely unconscious so that we can stay asleep. However, if we have strong enough unconscious material, that material boils up against the censor. The pressure builds and builds and would lead to a psychic breakdown if unchecked. The solution here is dream work that acts as a pressure release valve. Dream work results when some material is smuggled past the censor into the conscious mind, but in an altered, more acceptable form that will allow sleep to continue. The pressure of the unconscious material is thus decreased, yet the ability of the individual to stay asleep is maintained. This material that slips by the censor is called the manifest content of the dream, and it is what we consciously remember about a dream when we wake up. An example of this might be as follows. One day, George, who has a religious belief that sexuality is a sin, passed his mother on the way down the hall. While he was walking past her, he noticed the exciting experience of seeing the top button of her blouse undone, something that was very loaded with sexual innuendo to George. This starts George's unconscious mind going, and he is having increasing thoughts and memories about similar experiences with his mother. However, this material is largely repressed while he is awake. However, that night, while asleep, the strength of the psychic repression is loosened, and there is a return of the repressed, and the unconscious latent dream thoughts regarding the sexuality of his own mother boil up. The censor, feeling the strong religious and cultural taboo about this material, does its best to block the material from consciousness, and the pressure builds. So there is increasing pressure on the system. As the pressure builds, alternative thoughts press and contort the dream thoughts. For example, the face of the person in the dream is altered to that of an unknown woman with a cross around her neck. Rather than sex, the woman is praying on the ground, with George accidentally falling on her in a way that is exciting, thus embodying some of the aspects of a mother and some of the intense sexual and guilty feelings surrounding her, but in a hidden and manageable way, thus allowing George to stay asleep. He consciously recalls a manifest dream about falling on an unknown praying woman with a cross and feeling strangely guilty and excited. As you can see, this process involves a series of shifts of psychic material. 3 examples of these transformations include displacement, the change of one thing into another, condensation, the collapse of several concepts into one, and representation, transforming thoughts into visual images. Dream work thus accomplishes censorship, editing, and compromise, which allows the person to dissipate the sleep-disturbing tension associated with infantile wishes by smuggling them past the censor into the preconscious and conscious mind. This is all done in a mechanical and reflexive way, where there is no psychological work yielding maturational advance inherent in the process. Dreams are just a necessary natural byproduct of maintaining sleep. However, even though there is no psychological work being done by the dreamer in Freud's completely reflexive process of the mind while asleep, he did say it was a mechanism that just happened to be useful for psychoanalysis. To clarify this, let's go back to the example about George. Since the dream itself does not provide any actual psychological work, George continues to have the same conflict about his mother and sexuality the next morning. However, let's say the material was so loaded that in addition to having these dreams, the repressed material continued to boil up to a point that it began affecting George while awake. Now, every time he passes a church, he finds himself beginning to sweat and falling over. This is completely impractical, and George is just psychologically minded enough to realize that he needs Freud's help. He goes in to see Freud, who tells him to free associate. Eventually, this leads to George describing his experiences, and he tells Freud the manifest content of the dream. Freud then basically says that it is the job of the analyst to interpret the manifest dream, which is basically running the process described above in reverse, using all the information, training, and intuition Freud has to reveal George's own unconscious processes to George in a way that he can consciously handle. How does an analyst know what to say? According to Freud, analysts don't actually know, in any absolute sense, what they are supposed to say. They can only do the best they can using their honest experience and close listening to what is happening to George. In 1933, Freud said, "When the patient runs out of associations, we intervene on our own. We fill in the hints, draw undeniable conclusions, and give explicit utterances to what the patient has only touched on in his associations." According to this model of Freud's, presenting George's latent dream thoughts to George has the possibility of leading to true, though shocking, insight, and allow an actual process of psychological work to begin. For example, George might be able to come to terms with his own impulses around his mother, and maybe come to grieve the ways that he will never actually possess her. He might learn to come to terms with both his own sexuality and hers, and even decide to marry another woman who might possess the best qualities of his mother, so that he may, through compromise, possess the best parts of her in another person. Through this work, George's sweating and falling over should come to an end. To be clear, this is a historical model, and there are new advances in theories about the mind and dreams. We will discuss these in a different talk. Goodbye.